Can I eat what you're about to throw away?
Can I eat what you're about to throw away? The question was barely louder than a whisper. Yet somehow it silenced one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Wine glasses froze in midair. Conversations collapsed into uncomfortable silence. Even the pianist in the corner seemed to lose his rhythm. The young woman standing beside the table looked as though life had forgotten her. Her gray shirt hung loosely from her thin frame. The shoulder seam had ripped weeks ago. Her jeans were faded and torn. The soles of her shoes had nearly separated completely. Over one shoulder rested a large black trash bag tied tightly at the top. The kind of bag that carried everything a person owned. And perhaps everything they had lost. She lowered her eyes. Ashamed. Embarrassed. Prepared for rejection. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she whispered. "I haven't eaten in 3 days." At the table sat Catherine Bennett, a billionaire, a philanthropist, a woman whose name appeared on hospitals, libraries, and university buildings across the country. The restaurant manager rushed forward immediately, his face twisted with alarm. "Miss, you'll have to leave." Several diners looked away. Others stared openly. One woman laughed. A man shook his head with visible disgust. To them, the homeless girl was not a person. She was an interruption, an inconvenience, a stain on their evening. Then Catherine Bennett slowly stood. And suddenly the entire room grew still. The manager stopped walking. The laughter disappeared. Every eye turned toward the billionaire. What she said next would change 2 lives forever. "You will not eat my leftovers." The young woman nodded sadly. She had expected that answer. But then Catherine continued, "You will sit with me." The room froze. "And you will have a proper meal." For several seconds nobody moved. Not the manager. Not the guests. Not even the young woman herself. She simply stared. As if kindness had become a language she no longer understood. Then she slowly lifted her head. And that's when something happened. Something no one else noticed. Catherine Bennett looked into the young woman's face. Really looked. And suddenly her breath caught. There. Just beneath the girl's left ear. Tiny birthmark. Small. Almost invisible. But Catherine knew that mark. Because 22 years earlier, her daughter had one exactly like it. A daughter she had buried. A daughter she had mourned. A daughter she had never stopped loving. And in that moment, for the first time in over 2 decades, an impossible question entered Catherine Bennett's mind. What if her daughter had never died? What happened next would uncover secrets buried for 22 years. Expose powerful people willing to destroy lives to protect the truth. And force an entire city to confront a crime nobody knew existed. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching or listening from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story is only beginning. And trust me, the truth behind that birthmark is far more shocking than anyone could imagine. Who was Olivia Parker really? Why did a billionaire believe a homeless stranger might be connected to her past? How had a young woman with dreams of becoming a teacher ended up sleeping on sidewalks and searching through trash for food? And why would certain powerful people do absolutely anything to prevent Catherine Bennett from discovering the truth? At first glance, Olivia and Catherine appeared to have nothing in common. One lived in penthouses overlooking city skylines. The other slept wherever she could avoid the rain. One commanded boardrooms. The other struggled to find her next meal. Yet destiny has a strange habit of weaving together lives that should never have crossed paths. Sometimes the smallest moments change everything. A missed train, a wrong turn, a forgotten photograph, or a hungry young woman asking for a piece of bread. Neither of them knew it yet. But before this story was over, one would recover what she thought she had lost forever. And the other would finally discover who she truly was. Catherine pulled out the chair across from her own. The manager hesitated, glancing at the other guests. unsure whether to obey a billionaire or protect his restaurant's reputation. Catherine didn't wait for permission. "Bring her whatever she wants," she said. "And bring it quickly." Olivia sat down carefully, as though the chair itself might reject her. Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. She smelled of rain and exhaust fumes and the inside of a city shelter that hadn't had hot water in days. Up close, Catherine could see the exhaustion carved into her face. Cracked lips, sunken cheeks, eyes that had learned to expect disappointment before anything else. And yet, underneath all of it, there was something familiar. Something Catherine couldn't quite place, but couldn't ignore either. "What's your name?" Catherine asked gently. "Olivia," the young woman answered. "Olivia Parker." Catherine's chest tightened at the sound of it. Her daughter's name had been Faith, not Olivia. A different name, a different girl, surely. And yet that birthmark sat there, small and quiet, refusing to be a coincidence. "How old are you, Olivia?" 22, Olivia said. "I think. My birthday's in March." Catherine's fork slipped from her fingers and clattered against the plate. 22 years. The exact number of years since she had stood beside a small white casket and said goodbye to a daughter she was told had died of fever in a hospital 3 states away. A waiter arrived with bread, then soup, then a plate of roasted chicken and vegetables. Olivia ate slowly at first, almost cautiously, as though her body had forgotten how to trust food that wasn't scraps. Then hunger took over, and she ate like someone who hadn't simply missed a few meals, but who had been fighting to survive for a very long time. Catherine watched her, asking quiet questions between bites. Where was she from? She didn't know, not really. She remembered moving often as a child. Did she have parents? A woman she called Aunt Linda had raised her, in a small apartment 2 states away, until Linda passed when Olivia was 16. After that, foster care. Then nothing. Then the streets. "I wanted to be a teacher," Olivia said quietly, almost embarrassed to admit it. "I used to read to the other kids in the shelter. They liked when I did the voices." Something in Catherine's heart cracked open at that sentence. Her own daughter, the one she remembered, used to read to her stuffed animals every night before bed, doing a different voice for each one. By the end of the meal, Catherine had made a decision. "Olivia," she said, "I'd like to help you. Not with money. Not tonight. I'd like to understand who you are. Would you let me run a simple test? Nothing invasive. Just a swab, like the ones you see on television." Olivia's eyes filled with suspicion, the kind that homelessness teaches quickly. "Why would you do that for someone like me?" Catherine reached across the table and gently touched the small mark beneath Olivia's ear. "Because I think I might already know your aunt's name," she said. "And because 22 years ago, I lost a daughter who had a mark exactly like this one." Olivia went very still. For the first time that evening, she didn't look hungry. She looked afraid. The DNA test took 11 days. 11 days that felt to Catherine like 11 years. She didn't send Olivia back to the streets. Instead, she arranged a quiet room at a modest hotel nearby, paid for groceries, new clothes, and a coat thick enough for the coming winter. Olivia accepted all of it with a wary kind of gratitude, the gratitude of someone who has been disappointed by generosity before. "People don't just help for nothing," she told Catherine on the 3rd day. "Eventually they want something back." Catherine didn't argue with her. She simply kept showing up. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, she visited. They talked about small things at first: books, music, the strange habits of pigeons in the park across the street. Slowly, carefully, Olivia began to relax. She laughed for the first time on day 6, a short, surprised sound, as though she'd forgotten her own voice could do that. On day 9, she cried for the first time in front of Catherine, telling her about a particularly hard winter 2 years earlier when she'd nearly frozen sleeping behind a grocery store. Catherine listened to every word, and with each story, the resemblance grew harder to dismiss. The way Olivia tilted her head when she was thinking. The small gap between her front teeth. The way she hummed without realizing it when she was nervous. The exact same 3 notes Catherine's daughter used to hum. Meanwhile, in a separate part of the city, a man named Thomas Reed was beginning to feel uneasy. Thomas had once worked as a hospital administrator, 23 years earlier, at the very facility where Catherine's daughter had supposedly died. He had since become a respected name in private healthcare investment, sitting on the boards of 3 different companies, attending the same galas as people like Catherine Bennett. When word reached him that Catherine Bennett was asking questions about an old patient file from over 2 decades ago, his stomach turned cold. Because Thomas knew exactly what had happened to that file. He knew exactly what had happened to that little girl. And he knew that if the truth ever surfaced, it wouldn't just end his career. It would end his freedom. The results arrived on a Tuesday morning. Catherine sat alone in her study, the sealed envelope resting on the desk in front of her for nearly 20 minutes before she found the courage to open it. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper. She read the first line, then read it again, slower, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less impossible. Probability of biological maternity. 99.98%. Olivia Parker was her daughter. Not a coincidence. Not a look-alike. Not a cruel trick of fate. Her daughter, the one she had buried 22 years ago, had never died at all. Catherine sat in stunned silence, tears falling freely down her face, before she picked up the phone with trembling fingers and called the hotel. "Olivia," she said, her voice breaking, "I need you to come to the house. Please. Now." When Olivia arrived an hour later, Catherine could barely speak. She simply handed her the paper. Olivia read it once. Her face went pale. She read it again, and her knees nearly gave out beneath her. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "My aunt told me my mother died when I was a baby. She said there was nobody else. She said." She stopped. Her aunt, the woman who raised her, who loved her in her own complicated way, had lied to her for 16 years, or had been lied to herself. Catherine pulled her into an embrace, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. They simply held on to each other, 2 strangers who had somehow, impossibly, never actually been strangers. But joy, as it often does, came tangled with new and painful questions. If Olivia had never died, then who had been buried in that small white casket 22 years ago? Who had forged the hospital records? And who had taken a healthy newborn from her mother's arms and handed her to a stranger, claiming she had nowhere else to go? Catherine hired a private investigator the very next day, a quiet, methodical woman named Diane Foster, who specialized in cases exactly like this one. It took Diane less than 3 weeks to find the name buried inside the old hospital records. Thomas Reed. 22 years earlier, Thomas Reed had been a young hospital administrator desperate for money to cover gambling debts that had spiraled far beyond his ability to repay. A colleague introduced him to a wealthy couple, infertile and increasingly desperate, willing to pay an enormous sum for a healthy infant with no questions asked. When Catherine's daughter was born prematurely and kept in the hospital's neonatal unit for observation, Thomas saw an opportunity. He falsified records, claiming the infant had developed a fatal infection. He arranged for another child, a stillborn infant from a different family who had no connections to Catherine and no resources to question the paperwork, to be quietly substituted in the records. Catherine's daughter was handed over to the waiting couple within 72 hours, smuggled 2 states away under a new identity. That couple raised her under the name Olivia, until financial troubles and a sudden illness left her in the care of her aunt, a relative who had no idea the child wasn't legally theirs to keep. When that aunt passed away, Olivia, the daughter of one of the wealthiest women in the country, fell quietly and invisibly into the foster system, and eventually onto the street, with absolutely no one aware of who she truly was. Diane Foster brought the evidence to Catherine on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Falsified hospital documents, a paper trail of suspicious payments, and a sworn statement from a retired nurse who had always suspected something was wrong, but had been too frightened to speak up at the time. Catherine sat in silence as she absorbed it all. 22 years of grief. For a daughter who had been alive the entire time. Stolen for money by a man who now sat comfortably on hospital boards, attending the very same charity events Catherine herself had hosted. She thought of every Christmas she had spent visiting her daughter's grave. Every birthday she had marked alone. Every night she had cried herself to sleep, mourning a child who had been, at that very moment, growing up somewhere without her. The grief turned into something else entirely, something steady and resolved. Catherine picked up the phone and called her lawyer. The case became public within days. Thomas Reed was arrested at his office, in front of stunned colleagues who had known him only as a respected businessman. The story spread quickly. A billionaire philanthropist, a stolen infant, 22 years of separation, and a homeless young woman who had once asked a stranger if she could eat their leftovers, only to discover that stranger was her own mother. Reporters camped outside Catherine's home for weeks. Olivia, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, struggled at first to adjust to a life so different from the one she had known. She still flinched at loud noises. She still hid food in her pockets out of habit, even when she knew she'd never go hungry again. Old fears don't disappear simply because circumstances change. But slowly, with patience and therapy and Catherine's steady presence beside her, Olivia began to heal. Thomas Reed eventually pleaded guilty to charges of fraud, falsification of medical records, and trafficking in connection with an illegal adoption scheme. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison. The couple who had raised Olivia under a false identity had passed away years earlier, leaving no one else to be held accountable for what they had done, though Catherine made sure the truth of their involvement was recorded for history, so that Olivia would never wonder about the gaps in her own story. 6 months after that first night in the restaurant, Catherine stood beside Olivia at a small ceremony, formally restoring her daughter's legal name. Olivia chose to keep both names, calling herself Olivia Faith Bennett, a blend of the life she had survived and the life she had been robbed of. "I want to remember both versions of myself," she told Catherine that day. "The girl who had nothing, and the woman who finally has everything." 1 year after that first encounter, Olivia stood in front of a classroom for the very first time, not as a student, but as a teacher's assistant at a school for children in foster care, the very system that had once nearly swallowed her whole. She read to them every Friday afternoon, doing a different voice for every character, just as she had done years earlier in a shelter that smelled of bleach and broken dreams. Catherine never missed a single Friday. She sat quietly in the back of the classroom, watching her daughter laugh, watching her thrive, watching 22 stolen years slowly, gently, begin to heal. Olivia later established a foundation in her own name, dedicated to feeding and housing young people aging out of foster care with nowhere left to go. She often said the foundation existed because she remembered, more than anything else, what it felt like to be invisible, to be looked at and not truly seen, to ask for nothing more than a piece of bread, and to be met with disgust instead of kindness. She never wanted another young person to feel that way again. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of her heart, Catherine often thought back to that night at the restaurant, to the laughter that had mocked her daughter, to the disgust on certain faces, to the manager who had tried to send her away, and she thought about how close she had come to losing her daughter forever, simply because so many people in that room had chosen not to see a human being standing in front of them. So we have to ask you, if you had been sitting in that restaurant that night, and a stranger in worn clothes had quietly asked for your leftovers, what would you have done? Would you have looked away the way most of that room did? Or would you have looked closer the way Catherine Bennett did? How would it feel to discover that someone you walked past on the street, someone you judged in a single glance, was carrying a story far more complicated and far more painful than you could ever imagine? And if it had been you in Olivia's position, hungry, exhausted, and asking a stranger for nothing more than scraps, How would you want to be treated? Let us know in the comments how this story made you feel, and whether you believe you would have recognized Olivia the way Catherine did. If the story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness costs nothing, but it can change absolutely everything. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this one are exactly what we're here to tell.